Are you getting lower FPS in CSGO than you used to? It would make sense, what with how much has been added to the game and its groaning source engine over the years. Ignoring the map remakes, you still have to account for the HRTF audio, hitbox and HUD updates that it has received since its release, and the thousands of totally worthwhile weapon skins and sprays and gloves and sound packs that we're so happy have been added to the game. Problem is, it's kind of hard to test. I decided to use my dated backup PC and compared an old version of the game against the game that we play today, using both CPU and GPU limited settings. The old version of the game that I used is one that's easily available, accessible from Steam like so. I don't recommend it though, since you'll quickly remember how bad it was just months after release. The problem started when the trusty FPS benchmark refused to load and would instead crash the game. Believe it or not, deathmatch mode wasn't even included back in 2012, and bots were limited to 10 a map instead of my usual 16 bot stress test. I quickly realised that I would have to base my tests around this oldest version, but that I'd only be able to measure the amount of slowdown rather than what exactly was causing it. I did each test with low settings to stress the CPU, and with high settings and copious levels of anti-aliasing to stress the GPU. This should help me to determine whether the game has changed how much it relies on your PC's two main components. The source engine is typically CPU limited, so I'd expect that to make more of an impact. First I ran about an empty map. I used the same current version of Aztec on both versions of CSGO and ran about the same route with Fraps tracking FPS. These were the results. Indeed, when GPU limited, it appears that FPS has dropped by about 9% in normal play and 5% with the HUD disabled. However, if CPU limited, FPS has actually risen. 16% with HUD enabled and 18% without it. This may not be the same with your system, but at least with mine, providing the CPU is the bottleneck, then my FPS has actually gone up. Of course, an empty version of Aztec isn't that representative of normal play, and I'm sad to say that I've had to rely on bots to represent the additional load that players put on your PC, even if they don't exactly reflect the load that real players would cause. I'd expect bots to put a lot more strain on your CPU than normal players would, but have kept them in the same quantities and skill levels for both versions of CSGO, so I don't see why this should matter too much. We should still be able to see the difference the updated hitboxes have made. Since deathmatch wasn't a thing back then, I tested 10-player arms race for 3 minutes on both baggage and shoots. And this is where we can really see the differences. With high settings, there was a 15 and 25% FPS drop depending on the map used, and on low settings, 25 and 41%. I spoke with Bez and he couldn't think of any major reasons for why bots could take up more resources now, so I'm going to assume that these drops come from general engine updates as well as the updated hitboxes that were added in September 2015. Maybe the updated bullet penetration also made a difference. Or the sounds. Really, it could have been anything. In short, it looks as though the game has become more efficient if you're alone on a map, but add bots, and presumably other players, and the extra drop this causes far outweighs it. I can't pinpoint which updates or features caused this drop. It does seem more noticeable if your setup is CPU limited, though all systems have likely seen a drop of some kind. The real question is, do we find a 15 to 41% extra drop under load acceptable? Bear in mind the increased power of computers in 2017 compared with 2012, and the gameplay and audio improvements we've seen during this time for the game. CSGO was already a game that could be run in the hundreds of frames a second back in 2012, but given the jump from 60 to 144Hz screens during this time, and the skill increase within the game itself, I'd argue that higher FPS is more important than ever. The simple solution would just be to upgrade your system if it's old and struggling, though I can understand why people might not want to do this, especially if they're still just trying to play the same old games as they were 5 years ago. Obviously, I've only tested the differences between old and new versions of the game, and anybody looking to compare, say, different versions of maps or the impact the new HRTF audio has only really needs to look at the new or at least newer versions. I accept that my testing has been very limited. I suspect that even if you try testing the same things as I have, that you'll get different results, depending on your setup. There are no doubt many other things left to test. Maybe you could do some of your own.